Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us on a beautiful Friday morning here in Washington, D.C., and hopefully beautiful wherever you're watching us from around the world. I'm Jason Marzek, the Vice President and Senior Director here at the Adrian Arsht Latin America Center at the Atlantic Council. Today's event marks the start of the road ahead to the 16th Conference of the Parties to the Convention on Biological Diversity, otherwise known as COP16, taking place in Cali, Colombia, in just a few months. This marking the first of its kind in South America, which is, of course, one of the most biodiverse regions in the planet. I'm delighted that we will be joined shortly by Colombia's Minister of Environment and Sustainability, Susana Muhamad, whom we hear from regarding Colombia's key priorities for COP16, as well as some of the country's leading biodiversity initiatives. Given the importance of this COP16 kickoff, I'm also thrilled that we are hosting today's conversation alongside both the World Resources Institute, represented on today's panel by Rita Maria El Zaghloul, as well as the Inter-American Dialogue with Rebecca Bill Chavez, closing our event today. We see the importance of protecting biodiversity every day. From the tragic floods in Rio Grande do Sul, articulated by Governor Eduardo Leche here at the Atlantic Council just last week, to energy shortages due to massive droughts across the Andes. Biodiversity emerges as a crucial driver and asset for sustainable development and transformation across the hemisphere. With a large number of endemic animals and complex ecological relationships, biodiversity helps maintain the balance of ecosystems, provide clean water, pollinate crops, and prevent flooding and soil erosion. For this reason, it's essential to align climate and biodiversity initiatives, a significant goal of the upcoming COP16. It's also an issue that we focus on here from a global perspective through the incredible work of our Adrian Arsht Rockefeller Foundation Resilience Center. And we do so in the Latin America context as well. Just a couple weeks ago, as part of our continued commitment to U.S.-Colombia ties, we brought up a mayoral delegation from Colombia's National Association of Mayors and Governors with Afro-descendant populations, representing various municipalities, including two in Chocó, where a key part of the discussion focused on the need for greater support to protect and preserve the territory's wealth, which largely stems from biodiversity. So I'm again delighted to welcome all of our audience here today, whether you're here in the studio, joining us from Colombia, or anywhere else around the world. This issue of biodiversity affects each and every one of us. With that, I want to remind everybody that you can submit questions throughout today's event using going to the website askac.org. And with that, I'm going to turn over to my colleague, Jeff Ramsey, Senior Fellow for Colombia and Venezuela, who will begin with moderating today's panel discussion. Jeff, over to you.
Thanks, Jason. And I want to echo your appreciation of the World Resources Institute and the Inter-American Dialogue for partnering with us today. We're really excited to host this conversation on COP16, efforts to preserve biodiversity, and what the COP16 may hold for Colombia and for efforts to advance biodiversity initiatives globally. We are waiting on Minister Muhamad. The minister has a busy schedule this week in Washington, but as we stay tuned for her arrival, I wanted to sort of kick off a discussion with our other two distinguished guests for this conversation. We're joined by Angelica Mayolo, who is the advisor for strategic projects and COP16 for the city of Cali. She's also a research fellow at the MIT Environmental Solutions Initiative and a former Colombian Minister of Culture, and I'm happy to say is a member of the U.S.-Colombia Advisory Group here at the Atlantic Council. And we're also joined, of course, by Rita Maria El Zaghloul, who is the director of the High Ambition Coalition for Nature and People on behalf of Costa Rica, which is an intergovernmental group of more than 100 countries championing a global deal for nature and people with the goal of protecting at least 30% of land and 30% of oceans globally by 2030. That coalition is co-hosted by the World Resources Institute and the Global Environment Facility. Angelica, Rita Maria, thank you so much for being with us today. I want to start with you, Angelica. Your work has focused on ways that marginalized communities in Colombia, particularly Afro-Colombian and indigenous communities, are addressing climate change. So what do you think there are some ways that governments can harness this innovation and work with these local communities?
Thank you, Giles. First of all, I want to thank the Atlantic Council for the invitation and send a special greeting for other panelists, for the Minister of Environment, Susana Muhamad, and also for Rita Maria. As you mentioned, it's very important to highlight the role of ethnic communities in biodiversity protection, especially indigenous people and Afro-descendant communities that has historically worked to preserve natural resources, but at the same time, those communities has been highly impacted by biodiversity loss and climate change effects. So there are many conditions that governments, academia, and the private sector can promote to support the work of those communities. First, from the perspective of the work of the Afro-Inter-American Climate Change Coalition from MIT, we are trying to create original research that demonstrate the contributions of ethnic communities in biodiversity protections. And it's very important to have real data of the impact of biodiversity loss in those territories. But most importantly is to provide technical support to formulate projects that allow those communities to implement natural-based solutions projects that are able to stop biodiversity loss, but also to offer better economic opportunities for those communities, especially in nature tourism, but also how to take advantage of the traditional knowledge of those communities to guarantee a better quality of life throughout projects focused on the conservation of biodiversity. And in this frame, it's very important to work in innovative financial conditions, because even that the Latin American country has advanced recognizing land titles for those communities, we haven't created a real comprehensive financial system that support those communities to implement real projects. So it's very important to advance to creating research focused on being able to have real data about the contributions of those communities and impact, providing technical support to formulate projects that allow direct financial support from most of the international platforms that the Grand Climate Funds and also the Global Environment Facility, and to create a financial system especially focused on guarantee loans and economic opportunities for those ethnic communities.
Thank you, Angelica. Before we proceed, I want to formally welcome Minister Muhamad, Colombian Minister of Environment, and I also want to congratulate the Minister for receiving the Vital Voices Global Leadership Award just yesterday. I understand you were speaking with former Secretary Hillary Clinton, and we know this award pays tribute to women whose leadership is helping to move the world forward, and for that reason, we're really honored to have you here at the Atlantic Council. Minister Muhamad was also recognized as one of Reuters' 25 most influential women leading the fight against climate change in recognition of all of your efforts. And previously, she was elected Councilor of Bogota, and she's also held positions as Bogota's Secretary of the Environment and Secretary General of the Mayor's Office. Minister, again, we're so excited to have you. Would love to hear from you about what we can expect from COP16. This is the first biodiversity COP since the adoption of the Global Biodiversity Framework in Montreal in 2022. What should we expect from COP16 this year, and how is Colombia trying to marshal resources and advance global leadership on this issue?
Yes, a very important question. It's the first time that countries will present their biodiversity national plans to the Convention of Biological Diversity after we had the biodiversity framework in Montreal. We're going to be taking stock at the COP of what is the level of ambition that countries have, and if we will be in line with what we committed in Montreal on those 23 goals. We, as the presidency of the COP, will be adding up and with the CDB, the Secretariat, and making very visible and public what is the reality between the goals of 2030 and what countries are committing. That is going to be a very important discussion. Second, we're going to have an intense financial discussion around how are we going to finance those commitments. And that will have at least 3 levels. One level where the Colombian government wants to continue working on the more financial structural reform that is required. But so it's more a systemic level. The issues of debt, the fiscal spaces that countries have, because we can make a lot of environmental commitments, but if we don't have the fiscal space, how is finance going to be flowing? And at the same time, what are the innovative instruments that we could have so that those plans really have a backup? And also, if the goal of financing that was set in Montreal is going to be, if we are in the right trajectory to fulfill that. And finally, I think a third critical aspect will be the working plan for indigenous peoples and local communities. Colombia, as president of the COP, wants to make this the People's COP. So we want that local communities, Afro-descendants, indigenous peoples, peasants, have a very strong role, a very strong voice. We are guaranteeing 3 pre-COPs so that they can organize their positions and they can lobby governments and they can influence the decisions of the COP. And we will give a prominent voice or open the platform for them to be able to discuss the issues of biodiversity. We have to all remember that 80% of the biodiversity of the world is in the hands of indigenous peoples, and that has to talk to us on the way we live. Do we have a society and economy that systematically reproduces nature and life, or we have an economy and a society that systematically destroys it? And indigenous people has taught us that you can live in peace with nature, and not a little bit like we're doing now, which we see almost nature is like an enemy, and we are in confrontation with nature. And that's becoming a disaster, really, a critical situation everywhere in the world.
Before we continue with the panel, I would love to hear a little bit more from you about sort of the significance of this summit and what you sort of see as Colombia's role in hosting it.
Well, one of the key issues is that this summit will be finally one of the mega biodiverse countries. And that has also to speak about the geopolitical interest of the countries that hold the biodiversity. We are providing ecological services to the whole world. Biome like the Amazon is not only for the countries in the Amazon, although it's governed by the countries of the Amazon. It plays a critical role in the climate transition. It plays a critical role in the reproduction of life globally, and we have to recognize that. How is that value today in the economic system? How is that integrated in the perspective of the different positions of countries in the world? Is not. And that's why we are just destroying it. So we would like the mega biodiverse countries, we are convening them with Brazil at the General Assembly, United Nations General Assembly in September, to see if we can create a common position for some of the negotiations, especially the financing and especially the DSI, the digital sequencing of information, the genetic resources. And also, so that the voice of the Global South and the countries that hold the biodiversity, by having the COP in Colombia, should be increased. I think this is one of the effects. And second, also to have very strong participation of civil society will be the other effect of having the COP in Colombia.
Thank you, Minister. Rita, I'd love to turn to you. As director of the High Ambition Coalition for Nature and People, what global strategies do you believe are most effective in encouraging countries to commit to biodiversity preservation and reaching the protection of 30% of land and ocean by 2030, which I know is a central goal of your initiative?
Thank you so much, Jeff, and it's a pleasure to be on this panel with you, Minister, and with Angelica online. Really great to be here, and thanks to Atlantic Council for providing us the opportunity to be on the panel. I think there are several strategies, global strategies, that I think we should be looking into, and Minister Muhammad alluded to a couple. I think one of the most important points is the fact that the richest biodiversity and the countries that are most mega diverse are developing countries and are low and middle income countries. And the fact of, for example, having the COP in Colombia is actually for the region very, very important. It highlights the region, but also it's something that we need to put we're putting nature in the center, and I think it's something that Colombia has been quite vocal on. From the perspective of the High Ambition Coalition, what we have been doing is really trying to get the message out there on the importance of protecting biodiversity. What does it mean? I think there's always this component of this fear of the fact of protecting more and more nature would be in detrimental of human development, and it's not the case. We have to really change that paradigm. We have to change the narrative. So from the coalition's perspective, we have been trying to really engage, and we have looked at it in two different levels. The first level is the political level, and engaging and putting nature at the highest spectrum in the multilateral system and in the international forums, but also at very local and national levels. And this is why it's so important to bring the indigenous peoples and local communities to the conversation as well, because these communities are the ones that will be most affected by the decisions that will be made specifically with regards to conservation and protection of nature. I think that first component of kind of having those two levels of conversation is very important. And the other component, which I mentioned very briefly at the beginning, the fact that of having countries, developing countries, needing to do this shift and needing to step up, I think it's also important to make sure that they have the means to do that, right? They have to have the correct means, both financially and technically. So within the coalition, and I talk more from the perspective of the work that we do, what we have tried to do is really try to put the needs of the countries in the platforms of the coalition and in the tools of the coalition to make sure that we are kind of understanding what those needs are and what those gaps are, and bringing support to those needs in order to make sure that countries have the means to achieve this goal. So I think making sure to include more of also the community, making sure that we go a bit beyond of only the conservation kind of era, opening a bit more into the wider society is something that I think is needed, and those would be, I think, the main elements that from our perspective we have been trying to aim and push forward.
That's important. I want to encourage everybody who's joining us both here in our Atlantic Council studios as well as online to submit your questions to the panelists. You can do so by going to askac.org. That's askac.org. And you can submit your questions, and we'll ask them from the panelists. But I wanted to follow up on what you just touched on, which is this need for coordination at both the local and the national levels. Angelica, Cali is in the Pacific region in Colombia, one of the most biodiverse parts of not just Colombia, but also the world. How is Cali articulating efforts across the Colombian Pacific region, and how does that play into efforts to organize COP16?
Thank you, Joel. So definitely being the whole city of COP16 for Cali represents a great opportunity and a new moment, not only because this is the most important environmental event that Colombia has developed so far, but because it made possible to rewrite the image of Cali and the Pacific region, highlighting his natural wealth, and most importantly, because it has united all the forces from the region and the city, from government, private sector, civil society, and the academy. So I'm part of I will say multiple stakeholder coalition that are supporting Cali on several fronts. So one of them is to building an ambitious environmental agenda as biodiversity that implies materializing projects such as eco-neighborhoods, which implements community climate actions to adapt and mitigate neighborhood to carbon neutrality, also fostering natural-based solutions and green business for entrepreneurs in the city, changing business towards sustainable business, thinking into account the national green business policy, implementing the urban forest programs, which allows the expansion of urban forests in the city and the ecological corridors throughout the whole city, and other initiatives that technify the local environmental authority to better have monitoring control of all environmental impacts in all the city through sensor, digital monitoring, and other. But in terms of the region, so for us it's very important, and we consider this a momentum to highlight the importance of a very specific ecosystem, which is the biographic Chocó region, a hotspot of biodiversity, one of the most relevant and strategic ecosystems of the planet for its concentration of biodiversity, and high endemicity of species. So what we feel from the social civility, but also from some of the government, from the department of the region, Valle del Cauca, Nariño, and Chocó, is that we all are looking for solutions to the great challenges that this ecosystem, the Chocó biographic, is facing, and the community that live there. We had to highlight that the migratory crisis in the Darien region, who has a close relation with the U.S., create an environmental impact in the region. Also, historical challenges like the illicit crops and illegal mining that are causing biodiversity loss, which are challenges that we share with other countries, not only Colombia, Panama, and Ecuador. We are in the third corridor. So the region has the expectation to show the historical contribution that ethnic communities and local communities have meant to protect biodiversity, but also to advance policies and solutions that allow local communities to improve their quality of life, to stop biodiversity loss, and also to positioning the region as a destination for nature tourism.
Thanks, Angelica. Minister, turning back to you, you've talked a lot about the promise of COP16. I'm wondering if you can also touch on some of the critical challenges that Colombia is facing in terms of balancing economic development with the preservation of its rich biodiversity. And how does that tie into efforts in Colombia to harness its rich natural resources to address climate change?
Yes, we have to make a transition, which is very challenging. It's a transition that is not only the just energy transition that the world is talking about. It is a transition to replace the exports from coal and fossil fuels in the middle term. And that transition requires for other sectors of the economy to step in, and to step in a development that is sustainable. Because it could be easily, you can say, okay, let's have a replacement with monocrops, for example, large extension of monocrops, but is that actually sustainable to the climate crisis? So we have released a portfolio of investment for the transition with 4 sectors that we want to enforce. First, nature-based tourism, which is a way to actually replace the income from oil in time. Of course, this is a gradual transition, but that should put the environmental and the biodiversity at the center of having an industry, because it will be its main asset. Having good biodiversity should bring world-class nature-based tourism, and we're working with 10 national parks and their surroundings and the communities around them for that. And it's an invaluable asset that Colombia has, and that's why we have released the campaign, Colombia, the Country of Beauty. The second area or sector is energy. We want, rather than being the 5th coal exporter in the world, we would like to be a strong house for export of renewable energy. So it's the transition of energy inside, but it's the capacity to generate an export-based energy sector based on renewable energy. And a challenge there, which is still a worldwide question, is the minerals for the energy transition, and how those minerals will overlap with biodiversity areas, and what will be the planning processes locally and globally that would allow us to make that very needed energy transition, but at the same time not in the depletion of biodiversity. Actually, I'd like to highlight a point that Colombia wants to enforce at COP16, and is that taking care of nature and decarbonization should be seen as 2 key pillars of the climate transition at the same level. We cannot make, as today, decarbonization as a priority in the depletion of nature, because otherwise we will not be able to adapt to the climate crisis. Nature is trying to adapt itself to the new conditions that we already created in the planet, because climate change already happened. We are seeing the effects. What we're trying to do is mitigate it. But if we are not able to mitigate, and at the same time nature is very weak, nature will collapse. And if nature collapses, the whole of society will collapse. And that's a key point for COP16, and that's why this portfolio of investment for the transition has to take that into account. Otherwise, we will be like doing something with one hand and erasing it with the other hand at the same time. Just to finish, some other key sectors would be agricultural and agro-industry, but in a low carbon-based process. also energy, and also the transformation of transport as a key process. We will be holding an investment business round in June, to start bringing the private sector, but also the banks into this transition portfolio, and see if we can generate a new economic engine of growth based on decarbonization and taking care of nature, rather than on carbon, which is the basis of the Colombian economy, and the destruction of nature, which we are feeling the consequences of that.
Thank you, Minister Muhamad. So we have a couple questions here. Thanks to everybody for submitting your questions. You can continue to do so at askac.org. As we sort of round out the panel before we turn to the Minister for her keynote remarks, I just want to ask each of you to respond to one question each. I want to turn to you, Angelica, on something that the Minister just touched on, which is the role of the private sector at COP16 in advancing its goals. How do you see the role of the private sector in this summit and in preserving biodiversity more broadly?
Role, because the private sector is responsible to contribute in the transition to have a more sustainable economies, but also to work together with local communities to create better conditions for the conservation of natural resources. In terms of the region, we feel a very high commitment of the private sector from the Pacific region to contribute with the agenda to promote the Biodiversity Convention, but also to support policies that allow the transition of a more sustainable economy, and also to contribute with the environmental awareness that we will need to create in our society to promote a culture of care for natural resources in the citizenship. And it means to continue teaching about sustainable consumption of water, food, and the importance of recycle from schools and from the different cycles of learning in a society. And in general terms, I feel a very committed private sector from the region with this agenda.
Thanks. Rita, turning to you, we have a question here asking about specifics on COP16. What are the plans for anchoring the action points and commitments that will emanate from the COP into development plans at a municipal level, particularly taking into account the historic underfinancing of municipalities in some of these most affected areas?
Of course, I might not be able to talk about municipalities, as the coalition deals more with the work of the countries, but I can say that from perspective of how countries are kind of wrapping up their efforts in the run-up to COP16, we are engaging with the coalition in different international meetings to really, as I was mentioning before, engage with ministers, heads of state and heads of government. The minister mentioned the United Nations General Assembly. That will be a very important moment to make sure that countries are really working on their national biodiversity plans. They are mandated, the countries are mandated to be able to present those national plans during COP16. And so this is a moment where, from the coalition perspective, we're trying to provide also the support for countries to be able, from the perspective of 30 by 30, really present what their plans are with regards to 30 by 30. And I think from a coalition perspective as well, from the HAC, I mean, it's a coalition of 118 countries, but we also have many partners that we engage with, and the main aim is really to try to look into COP16 as a very key moment in this year, to be able to really provide the different tools and the different opportunities for countries to be able to tap into those tools. And I think you mentioned the importance of finance. It's something that we have been really focusing on. So as I mentioned before, we created 2 tools. One is a matchmaking tool. It's a matchmaking platform related to technical and financial needs from countries. So what we're expecting from that matchmaking tool is really to receive the needs of countries related to finance and to technical assistance that they require. And from our perspective, we are engaging with many financial institutions, multilateral banks, and really putting those needs into the attention of the banks and the financial institutions as well. So I think in a way it's really trying to bring the linkages between biodiversity, but also what is needed, what are the gaps, and trying to put that at the highest level. Taking advantage, of course, of the different international meetings to do that. And I think COP16 is our North Star of this year, and that's where we're focusing our energy in order to be able to, by that moment, present some progress and some specific needs to be put on the table and solutions as well.
Thanks. Minister, there's a question here for you about specifically Colombia's energy transition. What does Colombia's energy transition mean for Colombia, and how can it move forward addressing shortcomings in the oil and gas market?
Yes, it is a very challenging transition because, as I mentioned before, it's not only to replace some of the assets that we have in generation, which we can have some thermoelectrical plants, which, for example, were critical for the Niño phenomenon to be able to have right energy balance and not getting into energy problems. But at the same time, is how you replace the exports of oil and gas, especially for the fiscal revenue of the government, in a situation right now where we are in a high level of indebtedness and we require that fiscal income. But the question is, when do you start the transition and what are the financial conditions that allow you to do that? That's why Colombia has been a very strong advocate that we need other type of rules and arrangements globally, because we feel that no country can do, especially producer countries, can do this transition alone. Otherwise, the current rules of the market will punish the transition. And that's why what you see, in fact, is that when in Dubai we said we're going to phase out fossil fuels, in reality, what's happening is that the projections globally is that we're going to increase the production of fossil fuels in 110%. And the climate crisis will become worse, and we will not be able to mitigate. And Colombia is putting that perspective at the center of the debate. We need a new economical pact, and we need a transformation of the financial system. Otherwise, no economy will make the first move to decarbonize, because we are, you know what we're doing? We are decarbonizing the demand, but we are increasing the production of oil. How does this match? And this is because the economic question of oil has not been addressed at a multilateral level. We have not put our economic cards on the table, and we are not negotiating economic deals that are according to the transition. And that makes every single country to be in a labyrinth on this economic question, and that includes Colombia. And I see Colombia is in the worst position, one of the countries that is in the worst position for this transition because of our dependence of oil and gas without being one of the biggest exporters. We are not Saudi Arabia, we are not swimming in reserves of oil, so we cannot control the price. We can't, and our reserves will finish, but our markets will close, and at the same time, if we don't have an economic answer, it will be a problem. Now, what's the answer that we have to that situation globally right now? More debt, which we can't take, or the private sector. And the issue is that the private sector alone cannot create new economic sectors in a country. You need public investment to create the conditions for private investment. Let's say nature-based tourism, how you create the security conditions, the infrastructure conditions for these beautiful biodiversity regions in Colombia to be accessible for a private sector investment. And we're talking with the IMF, with the World Bank, with the IDB, in the international forum. This is the financial discussion we want to bring to COP16, to UNGA, and to COP29. Colombia will be keeping the discussion of the financial reform as a critical step for actually all the countries, including us, be serious about the climate crisis.
Well, thank you so much, Minister. I want to appreciate your flexibility and the flexibility of all our panelists as we move the program around a little bit. I understand that you have prepared some keynote remarks, which would like to hear from you about. But before we transition to that, I'm wondering if our audience could join me in giving a round of applause to our panel. Thank you all.
Thank you so much.
Please. If you wanted to do some keynote remarks.
Okay.
Yeah.
Bueno, thank you very much to Atlantic Council and to the audience for receiving us here. We are working very hard to receive the world in Colombia, in Cali, Colombia, for COP16. And the main message that we want to generate at COP16, the critical agenda for the next 2 years, is that we need to make peace with nature. And what does that mean in reality? What do we mean by that? We currently have an economy that is based on the extraction of resources, of seeing nature as a deposit of resources and separating our civilization, the way we live, from the natural systems. And we have gone out of limits in the way we live. And nature is coming back to us with a strong voice, basically recovering or in this process of massive destruction that we have caused in the process of development. Nature is coming back to us to remind us that we are not separated from the natural systems, that we do depend on the natural systems, and that's why we need to make peace with nature. Keeping this war, or as Secretary General of the UN says, keeping this suicidal war against nature is only causing that conflict among us increases. The climate crisis, the biodiversity crisis is tensioning. The disaster management is tensioning the capacity of governments, the capacity of the economy, the possibility of prosperity, the social inclusion agendas. Development and goals that we reach in 15, 20 years are suddenly erased in a few weeks in a global climate disaster. Processes of economic development that countries and institutions work for decades, as is happening, for example, today in the south of Brazil with agriculture, had floated to destruction, economic and social destruction. The global pandemic of COVID brought the development achievements of Latin America 20 years behind in a matter of 2 years. If we think that we can continue on this path of development as if nothing is happening, if we think that the same rules of the economic system and the financial system still applies, if we think that our current institutions, global and national institutions, are enough for the challenges of the new decade, the only thing we're doing towards the future is actually losing control, losing capacity to govern our societies and to govern our territories. And that lack of capacity to govern could be responded in 2 ways. Either we change the institutions deeply, we get into reforms deeply, we use multilateralism to get into new global agreements, new political pacts. We recover the capacity of politics and democracies to command new pacts and agreements, or we will be moving towards fake news, towards oppression, towards authoritarianism, because the lack of control is being responded through violence. And this violence is creating that world peace is started to be deeply affected. The situation currently in Palestine, where humanity is observing how a people of the world is being crushed militarily, and there's not even the capacity of the UN to provide the humanitarian relief. There's not even, because of political reasons, the capacity to recognize the Palestinian people as part of humanity, as people that have human rights under the Declaration of Human Rights, where international law has been crushed to its basis. That situation is what we could expect in a lack of governance and in a chaotic world because of the climate crisis. Are we going to leave the governance of the world to international law, to the capacity of institutions, to the democratic systems, or are we going to leave the governance of the world to the strongest, to the ones that can dominate based on arms and authoritarianism? And this is a critical question, an urgent question, where we from Colombia are saying at COP16, please, let's make peace with nature, which is the route to also secure world peace now and for the future. Thank you very much.
Now I'd like to welcome to the podium to give some closing reflections on this discussion today, Rebecca Bill-Chavez, who is the president and CEO of the Inter-American Dialogue, with whom we're so happy to partner for this event today. Thank you, Rebecca.
Thank you so much, Jeff, and thank you to the panelists and Minister for your closing remarks. I want to thank the Atlantic Council and also the World Resources Institute for partnering with the dialogue on today's very important discussion. And like I said, the three panelists, these are leading voices who embody the spirit of innovation and also the dedication needed to combat climate change, which are also at the core of the dialogue's energy transition and climate program, but also of our cities initiative, because as came out, I think one of the big topics today was that it can't just be at the national and the international level. Local communities and subnational units matter a lot as well. It's also fitting that all three speakers were women. At last night's Vital Voices celebration, Minister Muhamad pointed out that women are on the front line when it comes to protecting the environment, but also of mobilizing people. A key takeaway from this discussion for me was the need for collective action and bringing together diverse voices, including civil society, to the table to have these very difficult conversations about the actions needed to address the very urgent issue of biodiversity preservation and also securing the necessary financing for this, which also came up. Colombia stands at a critical moment. Hosting COP16 in Cali not only highlights Colombia's unique biodiversity, but also positions the country as a leader in the global efforts to tackle climate change. Minister Muhamad, your insights today have illuminated the significant strides Colombia is making in its just transition to renewable energy and also its commitment to leveraging its rich natural resources for sustainable development. And I really believe, I'm looking forward to being in Cali because Cali is poised to demonstrate how local actions can have global impacts, reinforcing the significance of community engagement in our collective efforts. So I also want to leave by saying that I hope we all take today's panel as a call to action, because it's by working together, by sharing knowledge, that we can make significant strides in safeguarding our planet for future generations. So I hope we can all leave here with a renewed sense of purpose and determination. And also, to your closing remarks, changing the narrative from one of being in conflict with nature to one in which we're making peace with nature. So thank you again to the Atlantic Council and to the World Resources Institute and to all of you who have joined us in person and online. I hope to see you all in Cali.